We are here in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. I'm Beth Duda. Welcome to Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, A Walk to Respect.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Beth Duda, and on behalf of the Patterson Foundation and the cast and the crew, I would like to welcome you to the Kennedy Center. Today, you are going to be seeing a play that I'm going to say was not necessarily written as much as it was crafted. I'm listed as the playwright in your script, but all of the words that you hear spoken by Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass are words that are from their speeches and their writings. And we also have wonderful poetry that was written by Cedric Hameed. So my job was more of an assembler than a playwright. We're so excited to be here in this historic theater to present a work that I think you will find interesting intellectually, but perhaps even more important, it will awaken feelings and emotions that I think are really important for us to acknowledge and explore. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, A Walk to Respect.
If there is no struggle, there is no progress. And if no one steps towards injustice, then every path leads to civil unrest. Lines are drawn, walls are built. As we try to stay civil at best, even our wars are civil. As the battle rages on in our chest, the pursuit undying as we claim our humanity through the perils of life unto the unknowns of death. And as our light of hope breaks through the gray clouds of despair, we take a walk towards respect by understanding each other's steps. History's being shaped now. The story that our children and our children's children will tell about our nation in this period and where we fit in the world are being formed as we speak, just as they were during the Civil War when Frederick Douglass spoke the words,
"If there is no struggle, there is no progress."
We are faced with partisan gridlock, disdain, polarization. What future will we create? How will we be remembered? Who will history revere? And who will history revile?
The best way to predict the future is to create it.
And then the bridge to equality will exist. We just need to frame it.
You cannot escape the responsibility of tomorrow by evading it today.
And if you don't create the world you see today, then the hope for tomorrow fades away. Songs of freedom drown out in the silent sounds of inaction. Lost in the muse meant for change, we become misguided by our distractions. We find ourselves taking steps towards injustice, finally laying to slumber the paths that lead to civil unrest. We take a walk towards respect by understanding each other's steps. And what do these two men have to teach us? Abraham Lincoln?
A great cloud of witnesses, which no man can number, composed of all classes and condition of men, at home and abroad, everywhere, have recognized Abraham Lincoln as one of the best and the greatest men ever produced by this country, if not even produced by the world at large.
And Frederick Douglass?
There is my friend Frederick Douglass. I saw you today in the crowd listening to my inaugural address. What'd you think of the speech? There's no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours.
A powerful friendship. History tells us it was so, but it was a long, sometimes bumpy road to respect. Both men were born into poverty, both self-educated, but with one important difference. Frederick Douglass was born a slave.
I was born in Tuckahoe, near Hillsborough, in Talbot County, Maryland. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far the larger part of slaves know as little of their ages as horses know theirs. And it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. My mother was named Harriet Bailey. She was the daughter of Isaac and Betsy Bailey, both colored and quite dark. My father was a white man. He was admitted to be such by all I ever knew or heard speak of my parentage. The opinion was also whispered that my master was my father. But of the correctness of this opinion, I know nothing. The means of knowing was withheld from me. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant, before I even knew her as my mother. I never saw my mother. To know her as such more than 4 or 5 times in my life. Death soon ended what little we could have while she lived, and with it, her hardships and sufferings. She died when I was about 7 years old on one of my master's farm near Lee's Mill. I was not allowed to be present during her illness, at her death, or burial. She was gone long before I knew anything about it, never having enjoyed to any considerable extent her soothing presence, her tender and watchful care. I received the tidings of her death with much the same emotion I should have probably felt at the death of a stranger.
I was born February 12th, 1809 in Hardin County, Kentucky. My parents were both born in Virginia, of undistinguished families. My mother, who died in my 10th year, was of a family of the name of Hanks. All that I am, or hope ever to be, I get from my mother. God bless her. My paternal grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, emigrated to Kentucky about 1781 or 2, where a year or two later he was killed by Indians. Not in a battle, but by stealth, when he was laboring to open a farm in the forest. My father, at the death of his father, was but 6 years of age. And he grew up literally without education. We moved from Kentucky to what is now Spencer County, Indiana, in my 8th year. We reached our new home about the time the state came into the Union. Oh, it was a wild region. Many bears, other wild animals still in the woods. and there I grew up. There were some schools, so-called, but no qualifications were ever required of a teacher beyond reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of three. So when I came of age, I did not know much. Still, somehow I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of three, but that was all. I have not been to school since. The little advance I now have upon this store of education I have picked up from time to time under the pressure of necessity.
I have had two masters. My first master's name was Anthony. He was not considered a rich slaveholder. He would at times take great pleasure in whipping a slave. I was probably between 7 and 8 years old when I left Colonel Lloyd's plantation. Oh, I left it with joy. So to go to Baltimore to live with Mr. Hugh Auld. I lived in Master Hugh Auld's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. But I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct, but had set her face against me being instructed by anyone else. All this, however, was too late. The first step had already been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and in different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read.
Two young men raised in poverty, motherless, self-taught, each yearning to make their way in the ever-changing world. In principle, both men were opposed to slavery. One was free, and one a slave. In 1827, 11 northern states passed abolition laws, and slavery was fully eradicated in New York. However, slavery had become increasingly important to the economic life in the cotton-growing South, and it was here in this climate that these two men would continue to forge their futures. 1828.
Flatboatman.
Slave.
1831.
Merchant.
Slave. Secretly studying the Bible.
1833.
Surveyor.
Slave. Sent to Edward Covey, a slave breaker, where I am regularly whipped and beaten. With every blow I feel my hope eroding and my interest in intellectual pursuits dying.
1834.
Elected to Illinois General Assembly.
Slave! Started a Sunday school to teach other slaves how to read.
1835 and 36.
Became a lawyer.
Devised a way to escape, but was discovered and sent to jail.
1838.
Re-elected to the General Assembly and made Whig floor leader.
Escaped from slavery on the Underground Railroad and settled in Massachusetts.
Over the next 2 decades, both men became leaders. Frederick Douglass became the most photographed man of his time, becoming a leader in the abolitionist movement, a publisher, and a sought-after international speaker. Abraham Lincoln, while less well-known, made a name for himself as a lawyer, leader of the Whig Party. They demonstrated strong values, eloquence, and an unwavering belief in their primary cause,
Abolishing slavery.
Union.
They were in conflict. Both were anti-slavery, but they did not see eye to eye in how to eradicate slavery. Frederick Douglass devoted his career to ending slavery everywhere and achieving racial equality for everyone. Abraham Lincoln believed that slavery was morally wrong, but he was more moderate in his language. He feared abolishing slavery would cause an unhealable rift with the South, causing the end of the Union, a chance he was unwilling to take. Lincoln wanted to keep slavery confined to the South, and he believed in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which prohibited slavery north of latitude 3630. Slavery was confined to the South, preserving the Union, and Lincoln believed in time, perhaps over 100 years,
slavery would surely die a slow death.
Then, the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in May of 1854 shook Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass to their cores.
The Nebraska Act took us by surprise. We were thunderstruck and stunned.
The proposition to repeal the Missouri Compromise was a stunning one. It fell upon us like a bolt of lightning from a cloudless sky. The thing was too startling for belief.
Instead of dying a slow death, this act allowed people in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to allow slavery within their borders, which could expand slavery to previously free territories. Lincoln turned his stunned surprise into slow, methodical action. Before speaking out against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he spent many hours in the state library studying present and past congressional debates so that he could reach back onto the stream of American history and tell a clear, reasoned, and compelling tale. He would express no opinion
until I knew my subject inside and outside and upside and downside. I am slow to learn and slow to forget that which I have learned. My mind is like a piece of steel, very hard to scratch anything on it and almost impossible once you get it there to rub it out.
Douglass, by contrast, spoke out immediately, building steam in his anti-slavery movement as he went.
This Kansas-Nebraska Act is an open invitation to a fierce and a bitter strife. The important point to me, as one desiring to see the slave poser crippled, slavery limited and abolished, is the effect of this Kansas battle upon the moral sentiment of the North. It is making abolitionists a people before they themselves become aware of it. And it is rekindling the zeal and strengthening the faith of our anti-slavery forces.
Douglass spoke out against the act, most notably during a speech in Chicago in October of 1854. Not everyone in the audience was a fan.
Friends and fellow citizens, I have the misfortune of being deemed an intruder by some of your fellow citizens. My visit among you is thought to be untimely and to savor of impudence and the like. Upon this matter, I have a word to say in my own defense. A man that would not defend himself is not fit to defend a good cause. Ladies and gentlemen, I am not sure that a visit on my part to Chicago would at any time afford those who are now complaining of me any special pleasure. But gentlemen, I am not ashamed of being called an intruder. I met it 1,000 times in 1,000 different places. Every inch of ground occupied by the colored man in this country is sternly disputed. At the ballot box and at the altar, in the church and in the state, he is deemed an intruder. He is, in fact, seldom a welcome visitor anywhere. Marvel not Therefore, if I seem somewhat used to the charge of intrusiveness and am not more embarrassed in meeting it, one reason why I am not ashamed to be here is this. I have a right to be here and a duty to perform here. That right is a constitutional right as well as a natural right. It belongs to every citizen of the United States. The people in whose cause I come here tonight have no national purse, no offices, no reputation with which to corrupt Congress or to tempt men mighty in eloquence and influence into their service. Oh no! They have nothing to commend them but their unadorned humanity. They are human. That's all. Only human. Nature owns them as human. God owns them as human. But men own them as property. Every right of human nature as such is denied them. They are dumb in their chains. To utter one groan or scream for freedom in the presence of the Southern advocate of popular sovereignty is to bring down the frightful lash upon their quivering flesh. I knew of this suffering. I am acquainted with their sorrows. I am one with them in experience. I have felt the lash of the slave driver and stand up here with all the bitter recollections of his horrors vividly upon me.
A fiery and emotional speaker, Douglass was not restrained by the obligations of pursuit of political office. Lincoln was a steadier personality whose opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act propelled him back to the political scene in 1854 with a series of public speeches.
I cannot but hate the declared indifference for slavery's spread. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions with plausibility to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many really good men amongst ourselves into an open war with the very fundamental principles of civil liberty, criticizing the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. Now, before proceeding, let me say, I think I have no prejudice against the Southern people. They are just what we would be in their situation. If slavery did not now exist amongst them, they would not introduce it. If it did now exist amongst us, we should not instantly give it up. This I believe of the masses, North and South. Now, doubtless there are individuals on both sides who would not hold slaves under any circumstances, and others who would gladly introduce slavery anew if it were out of existence. Now, we know some Southern men do free their slaves, go north, become tip-top abolitionists. And some Northern ones go south, become the most cruel slave masters. When Southern people tell us they are no more responsible for the origin of slavery than we, I acknowledge the fact. When it is said that the institution exists and it's very difficult to get rid of it, and in a satisfactory way, I can understand and appreciate the saying. I surely will not blame them for not doing what I should not know how to do myself. If all earthly power were given me, I should not know what to do as far as the existing institution. I would save the Union. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who say they would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and not to either save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I feel it helps to save the Union.
Then, in 1857, the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision added more fuel to the fires burning within Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. This case, presided over by Supreme Court Judge Tawney, ruled that a slave, Dred Scott, who had resided in a free state and territory, was not entitled to his freedom, that African Americans were not and could never be citizens of the United States, and that the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had declared free all territories west of Missouri and north of latitude 3630, was unconstitutional. This decision incensed and radicalized Frederick Douglass.
While 4 millions of our countrymen are in chains, while men, women, and children are bought and sold on the auction block with horses, sheep, and swine. It is meet that we assemble as we have done today and lift up our hearts and voices in earnest denunciation of the vile and shocking abomination. One thing, however, is certain. Slaveholders are in earnest and mean to cling to their slaves as long as they can and to the bitter end. They show no sign of a wish to quit their iron grasp upon the sable throat of their victims. Their motto is a firmer hold and a tighter grip. For every new effort that is made to break their cruel power, the case is one of life or death with them, and they will give up only and only when they must do that or worse. The Supreme Court of the United States is not the only power in this world. It is very great, but the Supreme Court of the Almighty is greater. Judge Tawney can do many things, but he cannot perform impossibilities. He cannot bail out the ocean, annihilate the firm old earth, or pluck the silvery star of liberty from my northern sky. He may decide and decide and decide again, but he cannot reverse the decision of the Most High. He cannot change the essential nature of things, making evil good and good evil. Judgment more fierce or terrible may come. The lightning, whirlwind, and earthquake may come. Jefferson said that he trembled for his country when he reflected that God is just and his justice cannot sleep forever. Already slaveholders go to bed with Bowie knives and apprehend death at their dinners. Those who enslave, rob, and torment their cooks may well to expect to find death in their dinner pots. The world is full of violence and fraud, and it would be strange if the slave, the constant victim of both fraud and violence, should escape the contagion. He too may learn to fight the devil with fire, and for one, I am in no frame of mind to do this, and for this it may be long deferred.
The Dred Scott decision further heightened tensions between the North and the South, and Abraham Lincoln spoke out against it, pitting him against his rival, Judge Stephen Douglas, as both men vied for Illinois Senate seat.
Fellow citizens, I'm here tonight partly by the invitation of some of you and partly by my own inclination. As to the Dred Scott decision, now that decision declares two propositions. First, that a Negro cannot sue in the U.S. courts, and secondly, that Congress cannot prohibit slavery in the territories. We think the Dred Scott decision is erroneous. We know the court that made it has often overruled their own decisions, and we shall do what we can to have it overrule this. I have said, in substance, that the Dred Scott decision is, in part, based on assumed historical facts which were not really true. Chief Justice Taney, in delivering the opinion of the majority of the court, insists at great length that Negroes were no part of the people who made, or for whom was made, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. On the contrary, Judge Curtis, in his dissenting opinion, shows that in 5 of the then 13 states, to wit, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and North Carolina, free Negroes were voters, and in proportion to their numbers, had the same part in making the Constitution that the white people had. Now, he shows this with so much particularity as to leave no doubt of its truth. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave, half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it to cease to be divided. It will become either all one thing or all another. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or the advocates will push it forward until it becomes lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south.
Now, although Judge Stephen Douglas ultimately won the Senate race, the Lincoln-Douglas debates put Abraham Lincoln in the national spotlight, leading to his nomination for president in the election of 1860. Interestingly, Abraham Lincoln was not anyone's first choice for the nomination.
Well, you know how it is in Ohio. I'm certainly not the first choice there. And yet I have not heard that anyone makes any positive objection to me. It's just so everywhere, so far as I can perceive, everywhere except Illinois and possibly Indiana. One or another candidate is preferred to me, but there's no positive objection.
To reach his strategic goal of becoming everyone's second choice, Lincoln was careful not to disparage any other candidate, nor was it in his nature to do so. Lincoln had developed a keen sense of what people felt, thought, needed, and wanted. He developed a cadre of lifelong friends who were willing to do anything in their power to ensure his nomination. He had not made enemies around the way or even caused any envy that he aroused. Even Frederick Douglass came around, if not wholeheartedly in support of his nomination. He believed he could turn the Republican Party into an abolitionist party and Lincoln into an abolitionist president.
The nomination of Mr. Lincoln has taken the people of this part of the country by surprise. He cannot lay claim to any literary culture beyond the circle of his practical duties or to any of the graces found at court. His political life is thus far to his credit, but it is a political life of fair promise rather than one of rich fruitage. We hope that in taking him on a profession of his faith, his administration will redound to the glory of his country and his own fame.
Despite that less than glowing endorsement, Lincoln was elected president on November 6, 1860. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860. Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, and Douglass wrote about his speech.
A weak and inappropriate utterance that announced complete loyalty to slavery in the slave states and denied all feeling against slavery.
Southern states continued to leave the Union, and on April 12, 1861, Confederates in Charleston fired on Union-held Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, effectively starting the Civil War. The very thing Lincoln most feared, North versus South, was a reality. Some welcomed war.
If there is not wisdom and virtue in the land to rid the country of slavery, then the next best thing is to let the South go and be made to drink the wine cup of wrath and power which her long career of barbarism and blood shall call down upon her guilty head.
Each day at war brought new conflicts and decisions. As Lincoln struggled to stabilize the Union, he assembled the army to preserve the Union.
I consider that the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity that is upon us of proving that popular government is not an absurdity. We must settle this question now, whether in a free government the minority have the right to break up the government whenever they choose. If we fail, it will go far to prove the incapability of the people to govern themselves.
One man hoped for a short conflict. The other?
The war must go on until one of the party to it is ground to powder. I want slave-holding rebels starved out, broken down, overpowered, and totally exhausted before they can consent after their high-sounding threat to do for peace. I should regret the sudden and peaceful termination of this conflict.
The war effort grew, and Lincoln continued to struggle to save the Union. An average of more than 500 soldiers were losing their lives each day. After Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which included a provision calling for black men to enlist in the U.S. Army, Douglass began recruiting for the Union. And as the war raged on, black soldiers imprisoned by Confederate soldiers were mutilated and assassinated. Some free black men fighting for the North were captured and sold into slavery, prompting a new rage in Douglass.
I owe it to my long abused people, and especially to those already in the army, to expose their wrong and plead their case.
Today, it seems unthinkable, but in August 1863, anyone could walk into the White House and ask to meet the president.
I call these receptions my public opinion baths. For I have but little time to read the papers and gather public opinion that way. And though they may not be pleasant in all their particulars, the effect as a whole is renovating and invigorating to my perceptions of responsibility and duty. These encounters keep me in touch with the great popular assemblage out of which I sprang.
The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those they oppress. And if there's no hunger for change, then the truth becomes impossible to digest. Finally free, but enslaved by my moral decree, I've escaped to see humanity's prison. It's built with the vice of lines and glass ceilings and walls that hide humanity's unifying prism. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. And people refuse to listen. On a sweltering morning, uninvited, Frederick Douglass arrived at the White House. He gave his card to his secretary and joined the throng of people waiting to see the president.
The stairway was crowded with applicants, and as I was the only dark spot among them, I expected to have to wait at least half a day. But within 2 minutes, I was quickly ushered past all of the other people, waiting and taken into the president's office. Lincoln was seated in a low armchair with his feet extended on the floor, surrounded by a large number of documents. Sir, I am Frederick.
I know who you are, Mr. Douglass. Sit down. I'm glad to see you.
My best friend is a person who will give me a book I have not read. But dreams have literacy needs to literally be free. Otherwise, dreams are dead, waiting on heroes who no longer dream to save. And I understand the sacrifice it takes to dream because knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. But the best thing about the future is it comes one day at a time. And through the long hours of the night, as we yearn for light, the absence of the sun can eclipse your mind. This is where you shine from within, because that's the path we all need to find.
I am disheartened.
Well, state what you believe is the most disheartening feature in our present political and military situation.
It would be the tardy, hesitating, vacillating policy of the President of the United States.
No offense was taken, for Lincoln truly wanted to know what Douglass thought, how Douglass thought, and in return, he would share his thoughts.
I might seem slow, but I think it cannot be shown that once I've taken a position, I have ever retreated from it.
Listening deeply to each other without expectation of perfection, sharing their perspective, their voices, their hearts.
Mr. President, I am recruiting colored troops, but my efforts are hampered by the Army's discriminatory practices. Black soldiers are paid only about half of what white troops earn and are not promoted no matter how bravely they have fought.
Mr. Douglass, you know that it was with great difficulty that I was able to get the colored men into the Army at all. You know the prejudices existing against them. You know the doubt that was felt in regard to their ability as soldiers. It was necessary at first that we should make some discrimination against them. Well, they were on trial. Black men have a greater incentive to enlist than whites do. They're fighting for their freedom. But as black troops continue to prove their courage to the nation, they will eventually receive equal pay. I assure you, Mr. Douglass, that in the end, they shall have the same pay as the white soldiers.
Mr. President, if Jefferson Davis should shoot or hang colored soldiers in cold blood, you should retaliate in kind.
Once begun, I don't know where such a measure would stop.
Lincoln, when talking about the mistreatment that black soldiers had endured, had a tearful look in his eye and a quiver in his voice.
If I could get hold of the men that murdered your troops, murdered our prisoners of war, I would execute them. I cannot take men that may not have had anything to do with this murdering of our soldiers and execute them.
Difficult topics, with their edges worn smooth by blankets of truth. Love of country, love of freedom, put before love of self.
Douglass, never come to Washington without calling on me.
I was impressed with his entire freedom from popular prejudice against the colored race. There was no vain pomp and ceremony about him. I was never more quickly or more completely put at ease in the presence of a great man than in that of Abraham Lincoln. I tell you, I felt big in there.
Douglass was not one to compromise where slavery was concerned, but this one interaction with Abraham Lincoln introduced him to the wisdom of the present's deliberate movements towards emancipation. The two men met again 1 year and 9 days later at President Lincoln's request. On March 4th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln delivered his second inaugural address with Frederick Douglass close by in the audience.
Fellow countrymen, at this second appearing to take the oath of the presidential office, there is less occasion for an extended address than there was at the first. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest, and all knew that somehow this interest was the cause of the war. Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth paid by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all the nations.
Later that evening, at a White House reception, policemen stopped Douglass at the door and told him blacks were not allowed to enter. Douglass sent word to the president that he was outside.
Within minutes, I was admitted. When Mr. Lincoln saw me, his countenance lighted up, and he said in a voice which was heard all around,
"There is my friend, Frederick Douglass. I saw you in the crowd today listening to my inaugural address. What'd you think of the speech? There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours."
It was a sacred effort.
And just 1 month later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. To know death is to know life, as you can live a life of decay as well as die and be celebrated. For none have ever lived life this way, so brave and yet so scared, so righteous and yet so imperfect, so unified but yet so alone in death, so isolated in grief, to give so much love only to see you taken into eternal sleep. It's the memories that make me weep, the words that make me cry, the pain that runs so deep because I can't seem to utter the words goodbye. To know death is to know loss, but it's also to go after what inspires you in life at any cost. Death and inevitability is a pairing you can't undo. But if you choose a life of love, even through the inevitability of death, nothing you love ever leaves you. It evolves, and in it you rise. The death of a caterpillar is forgotten as soon as you see the wings of a butterfly, and then you can see the true beauty of life is living without being afraid to die. And the better parts of one's life consist of his friendships. And to arise here as brothers, our path illuminates the design for what greatness is. First, you need a great struggle that creates a great divide. Then comes this great fear that we can't close this. The gap is too wide. Hate is too much. Love is non-existent. And in order to overcome, there has to be a great commitment. Great admissions about the great omissions. Adding inclusion and humanity to great revisions. The multitude of great failures can lead to great convictions. Opening our minds and healing our hearts from all these great afflictions, healing our souls from great regrets. In conquering this great divide, we have to walk that bridge from within, unafraid of our depths. And then, if we decide to rise and fall together, we can begin that great walk to respect.
August 17th, 1865. Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Dear Madam, allow me to thank you, and as I certainly do, thank you most sincerely for your thoughtful kindness in making me the owner of a cane, which was formerly the property and the favorite walking staff of your late lamented husband, the honored and venerated President of the United States. I assure you that this inestimable memento of His Excellency will be retained in my possession while I live, an object of sacred interest, a token not merely of the kind, the consideration in which I have reason to know that the President was pleased to hold me his personally, but as an indication of his humane interest in the welfare of my whole race. With every proper sentiment of respect and esteem, I am your obedient servant, Frederick Douglass.
If we decide to rise and fall together, we can begin that great walk towards respect.